This 1868 portrait of a freedman and his employer looks respectful until you notice the ledger, a script for old photos, Story Channel. This 1868 portrait of a freedman and his employer looks respectful until you notice the ledger. At first glance, the image appears unremarkable. Two men standing side by side in what looks like mutual regard. It seemed ordinary at first, the kind of photograph that ends up in local history museums, captioned with a sentence or two about Reconstruction and progress, until one researcher noticed a detail that would not let her go. Miriam Holt had spent 17 years as a visual historian at a small research archive in Columbia, South Carolina. In June of 2019, she was cataloging a collection of photographs donated by the estate of a prominent low-country family, the Rawlings family, whose roots stretched back to the colonial rice plantations of Georgetown County. Most of the images were what she expected: posed portraits of stern ancestors, sepia-toned shots of children in Sunday clothes, the occasional faded view of a plantation house before it burned or crumbled. But one photograph, tucked into an unmarked envelope at the bottom of the donation box, made her stop. The image measured roughly 4 by 6 inches, printed on thick albumen paper that had yellowed but not cracked. In the foreground stood two men. On the left, a white man in his 50s, wearing a dark vest over a rumpled cotton shirt, his sleeves rolled to the elbows. He had the look of a shopkeeper or merchant, someone used to standing behind a counter. On the right stood a black man of similar age, also in work clothes, though more neatly pressed. Both men faced the camera directly. Neither smiled, but neither scowled. They stood close, within arm's reach, as if posed deliberately to suggest a kind of equality, or at least cooperation. Behind them, shelves of goods rose toward a tin ceiling, and between them, visible at waist height, sat an open ledger book on a wooden counter. Dr. Holt almost filed it without further examination. But something about the way the black man's hand rested on the counter drew her eye. His fingers did not grip the wood casually. They were positioned just above the ledger's open page, as if guarding it, or as if the photographer had asked him to point to it. She reached for her magnifying glass. The ledger's pages were blurred but not illegible. On one side, a column of numbers, on the other, words. She could make out fragments. The word tools appeared twice. Below that, housing. Farther down, provisions. And at the bottom of the right-hand page, a smaller entry that looked like a balance due. The amounts listed were substantial: $12 for tools, $8 monthly for housing, $6 for provisions. But on the left side of the ledger, where wages should have been recorded, the numbers were smaller, much smaller, and they did not add up to anything close to the charges. Dr. Holt set the photograph down and stared at it for a long moment. This is not just a pretty old photo, she thought. Something here is wrong. Miriam Holt had seen thousands of photographs in her career. She had examined daguerreotypes of enslaved people, images of chain gangs, photographs of lynchings that still circulated in archives despite their horror. She knew that images from this era were never neutral, never accidental. The camera in the 1860s was expensive and cumbersome. Every photograph required intention, staging, and often a message. But this one troubled her in a different way. It was not obviously violent. It was not overtly degrading. If anything, it looked almost progressive. Two men of different races standing together as apparent partners in a business. And yet the ledger told a different story, one written in numbers that did not balance. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written a name and date. Elijah, 1868. Nothing else, no surname, no indication of who the white man was or where the photograph had been taken. But the handwriting matched other labels in the Rawlings collection, suggesting the photo had belonged to that family for generations. And the word, Elijah, without a surname, carried its own weight. In 1868, just 3 years after emancipation, formerly enslaved people were still often recorded by first name only, their identities stripped of the lineage markers that white families took for granted. Dr. Holt pulled out a fresh pair of cotton gloves and lifted the photograph to the light. The cardstock backing was slightly warped, as if it had once been exposed to moisture. In the lower left corner, barely visible, she found a faint oval stamp. The letters were worn, but she could make out part of a name. S.T. Blessing, it seemed to read, followed by Charleston. A photographer's mark. That gave her a starting point. She photographed the image at high resolution, uploaded it to her workstation, and began to dig. Samuel T. Blessing had operated a photography studio in Charleston between 1864 and 1881. His work was well documented in local archives. He had photographed Union soldiers during the occupation, wealthy merchants seeking portraits for parlor walls, and occasionally, at the request of certain clients, scenes of commerce and labor in the rebuilding city. His studio was known for precision and clarity, and his prints survived better than most. Dr. Holt found his name in city directories, his advertisements in old newspapers, even a few of his surviving glass plate negatives in a university collection. But she found no record of a photograph matching the one she held. That was not unusual. Many photographs from this period were commissioned privately and never catalogued. What mattered more was determining who had commissioned this one and why. The Rawlings family had no documented business interests in Charleston during Reconstruction. Their holdings were concentrated in Georgetown County, where they had owned a rice plantation before the war. After emancipation, like many planter families, they had shifted from enslaved labor to sharecropping and tenant farming. But the photograph did not look like a plantation scene. The shelves of goods, the counter, the ledger, all suggested a retail operation, a general store or supply depot. Dr. Holt reached out to a colleague at the College of Charleston, a historian named Dr. William Odom, who specialized in the economic structures of Reconstruction, South Carolina. She sent him the high-resolution image and asked what he saw. His reply came the next morning, 3 paragraphs of controlled excitement. "This is extraordinary," he wrote. "I believe you have found a photograph of a commissary store, likely attached to a turpentine or lumber operation. The ledger in the image appears to be an account book for what we would now call debt peonage. If you look closely at the numbers, you will see that the charges listed far exceed any plausible wages. This is not a portrait of cooperation. It is a portrait of legal bondage." Debt peonage. The term sounded clinical, almost bureaucratic, but its reality was anything but. After the Civil War, as the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, Southern landowners and businessmen immediately began searching for legal workarounds. They found one in the form of labor contracts tied to debt. A freedman would be offered work, often at a remote lumber camp, turpentine distillery, or plantation. He would be told he could buy food, clothing, and tools on credit at the company store, with the cost deducted from his wages. What he would not be told, at least not clearly, was that the prices at the store were inflated, that the wages promised were lower than expected, and that the accounting was controlled entirely by his employer. Within weeks or months, he would find himself owing more than he earned. And under laws passed by Southern legislatures in the immediate post-war years, a worker who left employment while in debt could be arrested, jailed, and returned to his employer by force. It was slavery by another name, and it was perfectly legal. Dr. Holt read Dr. Odom's email twice, then turned back to the photograph. The 2 men standing side by side no longer looked like equals. They looked like captor and captive, frozen in a pose designed to obscure the truth. And Elijah, whoever he was, had been standing beside the evidence of his own imprisonment, his hand resting just above the ledger that recorded his debt. The question now was whether that evidence could still be found. Dr. Holt began tracing the Rawlings family's post-war business activities. Estate records, tax documents, and probate filings eventually led her to a name. Horace Rawlings, the second son of the plantation patriarch, had left Georgetown County in 1866 and established a turpentine operation in the pine forests of Colleton County, some 60 miles inland from Charleston. The operation was modest by the standards of the day, employing between 20 and 40 workers at any given time to tap longleaf pines, collect resin, and distill it into turpentine and rosin for sale to northern merchants. Workers lived in camps near the distillery and were paid in a combination of cash and store credit. Store credit. There it was. Horace Rawlings had died in 1892, and his records had passed through several generations before ending up in the donation box that reached Dr. Holt's archive. Most of the papers were routine: bills of sale, tax receipts, correspondence with suppliers. But buried among them, she found a thin bundle of ledger pages, water-stained and brittle, that appeared to have been torn from a larger book. The handwriting matched entries visible in the photograph. The pages covered the years 1867 to 1869. Each entry listed a worker by first name only, followed by columns for wages earned, store charges, and balance due. The names were African American: Elijah, Moses, Solomon, Delia, Patience, Caesar. And the pattern was the same in every case. Wages credited were never enough to cover charges. Balances grew month after month, and beside each name, a notation appeared at irregular intervals. Contracted, it would read, followed by a date, or extended, followed by a number of months. Dr. Holt showed the ledger pages to Dr. Odom. He confirmed what she suspected. Contracted meant the worker had signed or marked a labor agreement binding them to the operation until their debt was paid. Extended meant the contract had been renewed, the debt refinanced, the term of service lengthened. In theory, these were voluntary agreements. In practice, they were inescapable. A worker who tried to leave would be reported to local authorities, arrested under vagrancy laws, and either returned to the employer or leased out to another. The choice was between legal bondage and imprisonment. Elijah appeared on several pages. His entries showed charges for housing at $8 a month, provisions at $6, tools and equipment at $12 to start, and then additional amounts for repairs and replacements. His wages, listed separately, ranged from $10 to $15 a month, depending on the season and the volume of resin collected. The math was brutal. Even in his best months, he fell further behind. By the end of 1868, the year the photograph was taken, his balance due stood at over $90, a sum that would have taken years to repay at the rates offered. But the ledger pages also contained something unexpected. Beside Elijah's entries, someone had made small marks in the margin, not numbers or letters, but symbols: a small circle, a diagonal line, a crude star. They appeared inconsistently, sometimes beside charges, sometimes beside payments, sometimes in the gap between columns. Dr. Holt had no idea what they meant. She photographed the pages and sent them to a third specialist, a retired professor named Dr. Constance Fraser, who had spent her career studying coded communication among enslaved and formerly enslaved communities in the South. Dr. Fraser called her back within hours. "These are verification marks," she said, "not made by the bookkeeper, made by someone else, someone who was checking the ledger's accuracy." This was a form of resistance. Workers in debt peonage systems often had no access to their own account records. The employer controlled everything, but in some cases, literate members of the community, ministers, teachers, or fellow workers who had learned to read would find ways to examine the books and note discrepancies. The marks you are seeing are a record of that examination. Someone was keeping track of the lies. Dr. Holt sat with that information for a long time. The photograph, which had seemed like a simple portrait of a freedman and his employer, was now something far more complex. It was evidence of a system designed to re-enslave black workers through debt. And it was also evidence of resistance of someone within that system who had found a way to document the fraud, even if they could not stop it. But who had made those marks? And what had happened to Elijah? The answer to the first question came from an unexpected source. Dr. Fraser mentioned that black churches in the Low Country had often served as centers of community record-keeping during Reconstruction. Many had been burned or scattered during the violence of the Redemption era, but a few had survived with their records intact. She suggested Dr. Holt contact the Gula Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, an organization that preserved the history and traditions of African American communities along the South Carolina and Georgia coast. Through the corridor's archival connections, Dr. Holt located a small Baptist church in Colleton County, Mount Olive Baptist, that had been founded in 1866 by freedmen from local plantations and labor camps. The church had experienced multiple burnings and rebuildings over the decades, but its earliest membership rolls had survived, stored in a fireproof box that one deacon had carried to safety during a night raid in 1876. The rolls listed names, dates of baptism, and brief notes about each member's circumstances. And there, on the third page, Dr. Holt found him. Elijah, called Elijah Blessing after his former master, baptized August 1866, laborer at Rawlings Camp, known to read and cipher, appointed deacon 1867. Elijah could read and cipher. He could read and do arithmetic. In the context of a debt peonage system where workers were deliberately kept ignorant of their true accounts, that skill was dangerous. And the name Blessing was significant. Many freed people in the immediate post-war years took the surnames of former owners, but some chose names that reflected their new status or their hopes. A man who had been enslaved by someone named Blessing and then freed might take that name as a mark of irony or defiance. But the photographer in Charleston was also named Blessing, Samuel T. Blessing. Was there a connection? Dr. Holt returned to the Charleston archives and dug deeper into Samuel Blessing's background. She found that before the war, Blessing had operated a small portrait studio in Columbia, where he had occasionally photographed enslaved people at the request of their owners. In 1858, he had been commissioned to photograph the household of a wealthy merchant named Thaddeus Blessing, no relation, but possibly a distant cousin who owned several domestic workers. One of those workers was listed in the merchant's estate papers as Elijah, age approximately 25, house servant, literate. The same Elijah. Before the war, he had been enslaved by a man named Blessing and trained as a literate house servant, a relatively rare privilege that marked him as valuable property. After emancipation, he had taken the Blessing name and eventually found his way to Horace Rawlings's Turpentine Camp, where his ability to read made him both useful and threatening. And at some point, he had been photographed by the very man whose relative had once owned him. The photograph began to reveal its full meaning. It was not a portrait of cooperation. It was not even simply a portrait of exploitation. It was a portrait of surveillance. Horace Rawlings had brought Elijah to Charleston, to Samuel Blessing's studio, to be photographed beside the ledger that recorded his debt. The image was a document, a form of proof that the debt existed and that Elijah acknowledged it. In an era before standardized contracts and legal enforcement, photographs like this served as evidence, a way for employers to demonstrate that their workers owed them money and were bound by that obligation. But Elijah had subverted the photograph's purpose. By resting his hand above the ledger, he had drawn attention to the very document meant to enslave him. And by quietly marking the margins of the real ledger back at the camp, he had created a counter-record, evidence that the debts were fraudulent and that someone was watching. The question of what happened to Elijah was harder to answer. The Mount Olive Baptist Church rolls continued through 1876, and his name appeared regularly until 1871, when a brief notation read, "Elijah Blessing, removed to unknown location. Pray for his safety." The same year, Horace Rawlings had filed a complaint with local authorities claiming that several workers had fled his operation without paying their debts. Court records showed that warrants were issued for their arrest, but no record of capture or trial survived. Dr. Fraser had seen this pattern before. When workers in these systems finally ran, they often headed north or west, following networks that resembled the old Underground Railroad. Some made it, some were caught and returned, some disappeared into other labor systems where they were not known. We may never learn Elijah's fate, but the fact that the church prayed for his safety suggests they knew he was in danger and they knew why. With the photograph's context now clear, Dr. Holt faced a decision. The Rawlings family had donated the collection to the archive with no restrictions, but that did not mean exposing its contents would be simple. The Rawlings name still carried weight in the region. Descendants served on museum boards, historical society committees, and local government. The family had cultivated an image of aristocratic grace and post-war adaptation, never mentioning the Turpentine Camp or its labor practices. Revealing this photograph and its story would challenge that narrative directly. She brought the matter to her supervisor, Dr. Alan Prescott, the archives director. He listened carefully, examined the photograph and ledger pages, and then sat back with a long exhale. "This is going to upset some people," he said. "The Rawlings Foundation has been a donor for 15 years. If we go public with this, we need to be ready for pushback." Dr. Holt nodded. "I know, but we have an obligation to the historical record, and more importantly, we have an obligation to Elijah. He was erased from his own story. His resistance was forgotten. If we sit on this, we are complicit in that erasure." Dr. Prescott called a meeting of the Archives Advisory Board. The discussion lasted 3 hours. Some members argued for caution, suggesting a private approach to the Rawlings family before any public release. Others worried about legal liability, even though the documents were legally the archive's property. A few questioned whether the interpretation was solid, whether the photograph might mean something other than what Dr. Holt believed. But Dr. Odom and Dr. Fraser had both agreed to provide written statements supporting the analysis. The ledger entries were clear. The patterns were unmistakable. And the photograph itself, once you knew what to look for, was damning. The board voted narrowly to proceed with a public exhibition, provided the archive also reached out to descendants of the workers named in the ledger and invited their participation. Finding those descendants proved difficult, but not impossible. The Mount Olive Baptist Church still existed, and its current pastor, Reverend Darnell Simmons, was a genealogist in his own right. He had spent years tracing the lineages of the congregation's founding members. When Dr. Holt shared her findings with him, he recognized some of the names immediately. "Elijah Blessing," he said slowly. "There is a family by that name still in Walterboro. They have always said their ancestor was a hero of some kind, a man who stood up to the bosses after the war, but they never had details. I think you just found them." The Blessing family was contacted. A great-great-granddaughter named Lavinia Blessing, a retired schoolteacher in her 70s, agreed to speak with Dr. Holt by phone. She had never seen the photograph before, but she recognized the story it told. "My grandmother used to say that Elijah wrote things down," Lavinia said, "that he kept a secret book, and when they found it, he had to run. I always thought it was a family legend, but you are telling me it was real." Dr. Holt told her about the verification marks in the margins, the symbols that Dr. Fraser had identified as resistance. Lavinia was quiet for a long time. "He was fighting back," she said finally. "Even when they had him in chains, he was fighting back. That is who we come from." The exhibition opened in February 2021, nearly 2 years after Dr. Holt first found the photograph. It occupied a single gallery in the archive's public wing, and it centered on one image. The 1868 portrait of Elijah and Horace Rawlings, enlarged and mounted on the main wall, with the ledger entries and church records displayed in cases below. A video loop showed interviews with Dr. Odom, Dr. Fraser, and Lavinia Blessing, explaining what the photograph revealed and why it mattered. The title of the exhibition was "The Ledger's Lie." Its subtitle was "Debt Peonage and Resistance in Reconstruction, South Carolina." Attendance exceeded expectations. Local newspapers covered the opening. A journalist from a national magazine visited and wrote a long piece on the broader history of debt peonage, citing the photograph as a rare visual record of a system that had largely been erased from public memory. The Rawlings Foundation issued a brief statement acknowledging the historical record and expressing regret for the actions of their ancestor, though some family members privately complained that the archive had blindsided them. But the most significant response came from the Blessing family. Lavinia's granddaughter, a young woman named Cassandra, who had recently graduated from law school, visited the exhibition 3 times. On her 3rd visit, she asked to speak with Dr. Holt. "I'm going to write about this," she said, "not just for my family, but for all the families whose ancestors were trapped in these systems. The law school I attended never taught us about debt peonage. Most people I know have never heard of it, but it did not end in 1870 or 1880. It continued into the 20th century. My great-great-grandfather was not just a victim of Reconstruction, he was a victim of something that lasted generations. And he fought it. I want people to know that." Dr. Holt handed her a folder with copies of all the documents, high-resolution scans of the photograph, the ledger pages, the church records, the research notes. "Tell his story," she said. "Tell all their stories." The photograph of Elijah and Horace Rawlings now hangs in the permanent collection. Its label has been rewritten twice since the exhibition, each time adding more context as researchers uncover new details. The most recent version includes a sentence that Dr. Holt wrote herself. "This image was designed to document a debt. It now documents a resistance." But the story does not end with one photograph. Debt peonage was not unique to Colleton County or the turpentine industry. It flourished across the South for decades after emancipation, trapping hundreds of thousands of black workers in conditions nearly indistinguishable from slavery. It operated through sharecropping, convict leasing, and company stores. It was enforced by local sheriffs, justified by vagrancy laws, and ignored by federal authorities who had lost interest in protecting the freed people they had once liberated. It did not end until well into the 20th century, and its effects shaped patterns of poverty and migration that persist today. And the photographs of that era, the images that fill archives and family albums and museum collections, are full of ledgers, account books, contracts, and tools of control that we have trained ourselves not to see. A portrait of a prosperous merchant and his loyal employees might hide the same exploitation that Elijah endured. A photograph of a happy family in front of a general store might conceal generations of unpaid labor. The camera recorded what was staged, but the staging itself was a form of erasure. Dr. Holt has since examined dozens of similar images, looking for the same patterns. A ledger open at an odd angle, hands positioned near account books, workers posed beside the tools of their own bondage. In many cases, she finds nothing, but in some, she finds the same story. Charges that exceed wages, contracts renewed without consent, debts that could never be paid. She has also found more verification marks, marginal symbols scratched into ledger pages by unknown hands, small acts of defiance in a system designed to crush resistance. Each one is a reminder that the people in these photographs were not passive victims. They were strategists, record keepers, witnesses to their own oppression. They left evidence for anyone willing to look. The next time you see an old photograph in a museum or textbook, look at it carefully. Look at the hands. Look at what they hold or touch or point toward. Look at the objects in the background, the papers and ledgers and contracts that frame the scene. Ask what the image was meant to say and what it might be hiding. Because somewhere in that frame, if you know how to look, you might find a story that was never meant to be told. And you might find someone who was waiting across all those years to finally be seen.